The air hung heavy with the smell of salt, oil, and the cold metallic fear that grips men on the precipice of destiny. It was the pre-dawn darkness of June 6, 1944. Across the vast storm-tossed expanse of the English Channel, the greatest armada ever assembled in human history, nearly 7,000 vessels, churned toward the coastline of Normandy. This was Operation Overlord, the audacious, near-impossible gamble to force an opening in Hitler's fortress Europe and establish a second decisive front in the West. Every single person on those ships, from the lowest private huddled in a landing craft to the highest general aboard the command vessels, understood the stakes. The entire future of the free world rested upon the success of this single, massive undertaking. Failure would not merely result in a temporary setback. It would mean the total irreversible collapse of the Allied war effort, the potential slaughter of tens of thousands of men, and the inevitable protraction of the war against Nazi Germany perhaps by years. Yet, behind the overwhelming spectacle of planning, deception, and industrial might, there existed a terrifying fragility, a series of critical tactical and logistical errors that, on that very day, threatened to turn the tide against the invaders, transforming triumph into a bloody, disastrous retreat. The sheer audacity of the plan, to land over 150,000 men and 30,000 vehicles across 5 heavily defended beaches in a single day, masked a profound and dangerous assumption that the Germans would react slowly, that the weather would hold, and that the sheer weight of fire and armor would compensate for the inevitable failures in execution. The plan itself, meticulously crafted over years, was a masterpiece of complexity, relying on the perfect synchronization of airborne drops, naval bombardment, and coordinated infantry landings. However, the complexity was also its greatest weakness, introducing countless points of failure that could be exploited by an alert and competent German defense. The invasion was divided into 2 main thrusts: the airborne operation and the amphibious landings. The airborne assault, designed to secure the flanks, seize vital bridges, and sow chaos behind the German lines, was the first domino. It required dropping thousands of paratroopers and glider-borne infantry, American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, and the British 6th Airborne Division, into complete darkness, relying on precise navigation, perfect timing, and individual initiative. But even before the first boot touched French soil, the plan began to unravel due to a confluence of factors, primarily the adverse weather and the sheer, unforgiving fog of war. The high winds and heavy cloud covers scattered the American drops far and wide across the marshlands and hedgerows of the Cotentin Peninsula. The formations broke up, pilots became disoriented, and the resulting confusion meant that entire companies were dropped miles from their intended drop zones, sometimes landing directly in German garrisons or drowning in the flooded fields. The initial mission, to create a clear path and neutralize key resistance points, was immediately compromised, forcing the scattered paratroopers to fight desperately in small, isolated groups, achieving their objectives piecemeal and often at extreme cost rather than through the massed, synchronized effort that had been planned. Simultaneously, the naval bombardment that preceded the landings, the critical curtain of fire intended to pulverize the German coastal defenses, proved to be far less effective than anticipated in several key sectors. The German fortifications, the concrete bunkers, the reinforced casemates, and the deeply dug trenches had been built with remarkable engineering foresight, designed specifically to withstand the heavy-caliber shells of the Allied fleet. While the bombardment did succeed in suppressing some forward positions and destroying a portion of the German artillery, it failed to eliminate the hardened defenses that lined the invasion beaches, leaving the German machine guns and anti-tank guns waiting often untouched for the infantry assault. The Allied forces had been conditioned to believe that the beaches would be swept clean by the preliminary fire, a psychological assumption that would be brutally shattered the moment the landing craft ramps dropped. This failure of the pre-landing preparation, combined with the extreme difficulties faced by the airborne troops, meant that the first wave of infantry would be hitting a much hotter beach than predicted, facing concentrated, effective fire from positions that should have been neutralized. The stage was set for a terrifying, unscripted battle where the carefully choreographed plan dissolved into a desperate struggle for survival against the superior knowledge and preparedness of the German defenders. The German response, initially slow and hampered by the brilliant success of the Allied deception plan, Operation Fortitude, was characterized by the high quality of the troops actually defending the coastline. The beaches were held by a mix of static divisions, which, though often manned by older soldiers or those less fit for the Eastern Front, were deeply entrenched and intimately familiar with every inch of the defensive terrain. Crucially, the defenses were layered, extending far inland and utilizing the unique landscape of the Norman hedgerows, the bocage, to create a natural defensive maze. The coastal fortifications were merely the first line of resistance. The true strength of the German defense lay in the rapid reaction of their armored reserve divisions, particularly the elite SS Panzer divisions. The Allied Supreme Command had gambled that the German High Command, OKW, would hold back these crucial armored units, convinced that the main invasion would occur elsewhere. This gamble largely paid off initially, but the immediate ferocious reaction of the German defenders who were present, combined with the catastrophic scattering of the airborne forces, highlighted the razor-thin margin of error upon which the entire invasion was predicated. The greatest gamble in history was underway, and the initial chaotic reports filtering back across the Channel suggested that the meticulous plan was already flirting dangerously with disaster. The initial chaos and scattering of the airborne forces were merely the prelude to the true tactical crisis that unfolded on the invasion beaches, a crisis most acutely and brutally realized on Omaha Beach. This sector, codenamed by the Americans, was always recognized as the most difficult objective. A concave crescent of sand, backed by steep bluffs rising over 100 feet, offering the German defenders a perfect, unassailable field of fire. The defenses here were known to be formidable, yet the planners had grossly underestimated two critical factors that led directly to the near-total collapse of the landing operation: the density and depth of the German defense and the complete failure of the armored support systems to survive the transit and the initial landing phase. The reality faced by the American 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions that morning was not a hot beach, but a killing zone, a concentrated maelstrom of coordinated fire that threatened to annihilate the invasion force before it could even set foot on dry sand. The planned pre-landing suppression fire on Omaha was a catastrophic failure. A combination of heavy smoke, poor visibility, and the deep, hardened nature of the German casemates meant that the naval bombardment simply missed or failed to penetrate the key strongpoints. Crucially, the intelligence assessments had failed to account for the presence of a top-tier German unit, the veteran 352nd Infantry Division, which had been moved into the sector shortly before the invasion, replacing a less combat-ready, static formation. The American forces were thus landing directly into the guns of a highly motivated, battle-ready division, a surprise that instantly negated the assumed advantage of the initial assault. The German machine gunners, protected by reinforced concrete, had a clear, unobstructed view of the entire beach, turning the flat, open sand into a shooting gallery, where every Allied soldier became a visible, vulnerable target. The slaughter began the moment the ramps dropped. The failure of the specialized armored support was the final, devastating blow. The plan relied heavily on the deployment of duplex drive, DD amphibious tanks, Shermans fitted with a canvas skirt and twin propellers, designed to swim ashore ahead of the infantry and provide immediate, heavy covering fire. However, the unexpected high seas and strong currents that morning proved too much for these delicate vehicles. Launched too far out from the beach by their commanders who feared for the lives of their crews, dozens of the DD tanks quickly foundered and sank in the deep, churning water. Of the 32 DD tanks launched in the American sector, only 2 made it to the beach under their own power. This loss of immediate armored support was catastrophic, leaving the assault infantry completely exposed to the merciless German fire, without the heavy guns necessary to suppress the bunkers or the armor to shield their advance. The infantry, pinned down by the concentrated machine gun and mortar fire, were trapped in a brutal, impossible position. The incoming tide was rapidly sweeping in, threatening to drown the wounded and those seeking cover near the water's edge, while every attempt to move forward up the steep open beach met with instant, lethal resistance. The situation on Omaha quickly deteriorated into a crisis of command and control. The loss of communications, the destruction of landing craft, and the sheer volume of casualties created a massive bottleneck of men and equipment near the waterline. Bodies piled up, equipment was abandoned, and the entire landing force was on the brink of paralysis. At one point, the senior American officer on the beach reported that the operation had failed and was near collapse, suggesting a full-scale withdrawal might be necessary to prevent total annihilation. It was only the extraordinary, desperate courage and decentralized leadership of junior officers and enlisted men who took the initiative to organize small, improvised groups and blow holes through the wire and the sea walls that managed to create tiny, bloody breakthroughs. Men like Brigadier General Norman Cota, a key figure in the 29th Division, personally rallied shattered units, pushing them off the beach and up the bluffs in a desperate last-ditch effort to gain a foothold. This moment of crisis was a textbook example of how a massive, perfectly planned operation can be saved not by the grand strategy of the commanders, but by the sheer individual will of the soldiers on the ground, who, facing certain death, refused to retreat. Omaha Beach cost the American forces over 2,400 casualties in a matter of hours, a blood sacrifice that came perilously close to failing and potentially exposing the flanks of the other Allied beachheads to a devastating counterattack. The success on this beach, achieved by the narrowest of margins, was a stark, brutal warning of the fragility of the entire operation. Listen up, boots on the ground. You've just walked the sands of Omaha with those brave men, and you know how close we came to total disaster. This isn't just a history lesson, it's a look at the grit that saved the free world. If the raw truth of that sacrifice hits you like shrapnel, then you belong here. Subscribe now and join the ranks of those who never forget the real cost of war. And we need your intel. In the comments below, identify the single greatest tactical mistake that day. Was it the failure of the DD tanks, the intelligence blunder about the 352nd Division, or the inadequacy of the naval fire? Drop your after-action report below. Let's honor their fight with our analysis. The catastrophic, near failure at Omaha was overcome by the sheer brutal determination of the American infantry, but the problems of the invasion did not end at the high water mark. Once the Allied forces succeeded in securing their beachheads, Gold, Sword, Juneau, and the other American sector, Utah, they immediately ran headlong into the second, more insidious tactical obstacle: the Norman countryside, known locally as the bocage. This unique, dense landscape of hedgerows, thick banks of earth and foliage often rising 10 to 15 feet high, interspersed with sunken roads and small irregular fields, was an agricultural feature that the pre-invasion planners had profoundly and disastrously underestimated. For the Germans, the bocage was not an obstacle. It was a perfect pre-built defensive fortress, an ideal environment for the protracted attritional warfare they now needed to fight to contain the Allied advance. The tactical shock experienced by the Allied infantry, particularly the American forces pushing inland from Omaha and Utah, was immediate and paralyzing. The bocage negated the massive Allied advantage in armor, speed, and air superiority. Every field became a fortified kill zone, every sunken lane a perfect anti-tank ambush point. The high, thick earthen banks, often centuries old, provided the German defenders with perfect impervious cover from small arms fire and, crucially, excellent concealment for anti-tank guns and snipers. For the advancing tanks, the hedgerows were impassable obstacles, forcing the armor to funnel onto the narrow mined roads, or to attempt to climb the banks, exposing their vulnerable underbellies to enemy fire. The fighting devolved from a rapid armored advance into a grinding, miserable infantry battle, reminiscent of the trench warfare of the Great War, but fought with the speed and lethality of modern concealed weaponry. The initial Allied strategy, which assumed a swift armored breakout into the open French plains, was instantly rendered obsolete by the sheer brutal reality of the terrain. The logistical failure was equally profound. The entire invasion plan was predicated on the rapid consolidation of the beachheads and the quick establishment of a logistical flow sufficient to support the vast number of men and vehicles pouring ashore. However, the unexpected resistance on the beaches, combined with the incredibly slow pace of the bocage fighting, meant that the beach exits and supply lines quickly became choked, creating massive, immovable bottlenecks. The roads behind the beaches designed to handle a rapid forward movement were instead jammed with static convoys, casualties, and the wreckage of vehicles destroyed by German artillery fire which, though often inaccurate, could still wreak havoc on concentrated supply lines. This logistical paralysis, a direct consequence of the tactical failure to break out of the bocage, meant that essential supplies, particularly the massive amounts of artillery ammunition needed to dislodge the entrenched German defenders, often failed to reach the frontline units in the required quantity or speed. The entire invasion, having survived the beaches, was now struggling to breathe in the suffocating embrace of the Norman countryside. The German defenders, quickly recovering from the initial shock of the invasion, adapted brilliantly to the bocage environment. The experienced German infantry and, later, the elite Panzer Grenadiers became masters of the defense in depth, utilizing the terrain to their maximum advantage. They did not attempt to hold continuous lines. Instead, they established a series of mutually supporting strongpoints, camouflaged so effectively that Allied troops often found themselves under intense fire from positions they could not see or reach. The fighting became a nightmarish game of inches, where every field had to be cleared with costly, brutal house-to-house or hedgerow-to-hedgerow tactics. The official American doctrine, which emphasized overwhelming firepower and mobility, was suddenly useless. The infantry was forced to fight on the Germans' terms, in close quarters, relying on grenades, flamethrowers, and sheer audacity to clear the enemy out of their earthen fortresses. The casualty rates climbed precipitously, and the projected timeline for the capture of key cities like Carentan and Saint-Lô stretched from days into agonizing weeks. The Allied advance, intended as a sprint, had bogged down into a bloody tactical crawl, a direct and dangerous consequence of the disastrous underestimation of the defensive potential inherent in the bocage terrain. The hidden tactical error was not on the beaches, but in the map rooms, where the unique lethal character of the Norman countryside had been fatally overlooked. While the Allied forces struggled through the nightmare of the bocage, the German High Command was engaged in its own series of blunders and critical, calculated risks that, paradoxically, strengthened their initial defensive posture. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the commander of Army Group B responsible for the coastal defense, and Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, were locked in a perpetual, frustrating disagreement over the deployment of the crucial armored reserve divisions, the Panzer Force. Rommel, convinced that the only way to defeat the invasion was to throw the panzers directly onto the beaches before the Allied forces could establish a secure foothold, argued for a forward deployment near the coast. Von Rundstedt, relying on classic military doctrine, argued for a centralized reserve held further inland, ready to counterattack once the main Allied thrust was identified. This paralyzing internal dispute, exacerbated by the constant nervous interference of Hitler from his distant command post in Bavaria, led to a fatal compromise. The armored divisions were largely held back, placed under the direct frustrating control of the High Command, OKW, requiring Hitler's personal authorization for their movement. This command paralysis was the strategic error that ultimately doomed the German defense, preventing a massive, coordinated counterattack on D-Day that could have potentially smashed the tenuous Allied beachheads. However, The initial slowness of the German reaction was offset by the sheer, vicious quality of the defenders who were present. The German High Command, having recovered from the initial shock and the confusion sown by Allied deception, began to pour a constant, relentless stream of reinforcements into the Normandy sector. Crucially, the quality of these reinforcements was high, including elite units like the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend and the Panzer Lehr Division. These forces were committed to the sector not to launch sweeping counteroffensives, but to fight a methodical, attritional containment battle. Their mission was clear: to bleed the Allies white in the confined spaces of the bocage, preventing any breakout and tying up the maximum number of Allied divisions for the minimum German cost. This calculated risk, fighting a close-quarters containment battle, leveraged the bocage terrain brilliantly and turned the Allied advance into a grinding, agonizing process. The German strategy was based on a sober, tactical assessment. They could not hope to defeat the Allies in a war of maneuver or open-field battle, given the Allied dominance in the air. The vast superiority of the Allied air forces, the fighter-bombers that patrolled the skies relentlessly, instantly punishing any large German column that moved in daylight, meant that the German army was largely confined to nocturnal movement and deep concealment. Thus, the bocage was their natural savior. The dense foliage, the sunken roads, and the high earthen banks provided the perfect camouflage against aerial observation and attack. The German commanders expertly positioned their anti-tank guns and heavy machine guns in the hedgerows, creating a series of interlocking fire zones that could decimate Allied infantry without exposing the German gunners to easy retaliation. The fighting became a series of desperate, small unit actions, where the Allied advantage in heavy weapons and logistics was neutralized by the German mastery of defensive concealment and localized firepower. The viciousness of the German defense was particularly evident in the fighting for key objectives, like Carentan and St. Lo. These battles, fought by American and German forces in the close, deadly confines of ruined towns and thick hedgerows, were prolonged, bloody slugging matches that resulted in immense casualties for both sides. The 12th SS Panzer Division, composed of fanatically motivated, often teenaged soldiers, fought with an almost suicidal tenacity, holding every building and every hedgerow with a level of ferocity that shocked the American and Canadian forces. Their objective was not necessarily to win the battle for the town, but to delay the Allied advance by days or even weeks, buying the necessary time for the rest of the German forces to organize and construct the next defensive line. This high-cost attritional defense was Kesselring's ultimate strategic counter to the Allied invasion. He understood that while he could not prevent the lodgment, he could ensure that the price of the Allied advance was so high, and the delay so significant, that the window for a decisive Allied breakout would close. The Allied High Command, initially planning to be far inland by the time the Germans reacted, found themselves instead locked into a debilitating high-casualty stalemate that raised serious doubts about the long-term viability of the beachhead. The hidden tactical error of underestimating the defensive potential of the bocage was being paid for in vast amounts of Allied blood. The very success of the landings was now threatened by the agonizing slowness of the advance inland. As the bocage fighting ground on into late June and early July, the Allied advance, particularly the American thrust toward the key port city of Cherbourg, began to experience a new, profound crisis: a crippling fuel and logistical shortfall. The entire D-Day operation was predicated on the rapid capture of a major deep-water port, specifically Cherbourg, to handle the vast tonnages of supplies, food, ammunition, and, most critically, fuel, required to sustain a continental army. The planners had correctly foreseen that relying solely on the temporary Mulberry artificial harbors, which were complex and vulnerable, would not be sufficient for the long term. However, the fierce German defense of Cherbourg, which resisted capture far longer than projected, coupled with a devastating and prolonged storm that crippled the Mulberry harbors, plunged the Allied logistical chain into a dangerous near-breaking point crisis. The Allied forces had secured a foothold, but they were now struggling to keep their massive, fuel-thirsty war machine running. The immediate problem was the Great Storm of June 19, 22, a meteorological event of such ferocity that it destroyed the American Mulberry Harbor at Omaha Beach and severely damaged the British one at Arromanches. This catastrophic loss of docking capacity meant that the massive influx of supplies planned for the third and fourth weeks of the invasion simply could not be landed effectively. Ships were delayed, cargo was damaged, and the entire logistical pipeline was thrown into chaos. While the British harbor at Arromanches proved more resilient, its capacity alone could not sustain the entire Allied front. The invasion, having survived the German guns, was now being attacked and partially crippled by the weather, a variable that, despite the initial delay of the invasion, had returned with a vengeance to wreak havoc on the vulnerable logistical chain. The loss of the Omaha harbor was a severe blow, forcing the Americans to rely entirely on the precarious and slow process of landing supplies directly onto the beaches, a process highly susceptible to enemy fire and weather conditions. The fuel shortage was the most immediate and dangerous consequence of this logistical failure. The modern mechanized Allied army, with its thousands of tanks, trucks, and armored vehicles, consumed gasoline at a colossal, unsustainable rate. Without sufficient fuel, the massive American armored divisions, the entire strike force intended for the breakout, were rendered immobile. The fighting in the bocage was consuming fuel at an unprecedented pace, as tanks and vehicles spent hours idling, struggling to maneuver across the difficult terrain, or burning fuel simply waiting in the immense traffic jams that choked the few available roads. The fuel shortage became so acute that it forced severe rationing at the front lines, limiting the ability of forward units to conduct necessary reconnaissance, repositioning, or most critically, to launch the planned armored offensives. Commanders were forced to make agonizing choices, prioritizing the fuel for essential supply trucks over the tanks needed for the push inland. This forced logistical slowdown was a direct gift to the German defenders. The Allied High Command had planned to launch Operation Cobra, the decisive armored breakout, in late June. The fuel crisis, coupled with the slow pace of the bocage fighting and the need to wait for the arrival of fresh armored divisions and replacement equipment, forced a crucial, dangerous delay of nearly 3 weeks. This delay provided the German commanders with invaluable time to solidify their defenses, bring in more elite SS Panzer divisions, and construct a deeper, more resilient defensive perimeter around the key city of St. Lo. What should have been a period of relentless Allied pressure and swift exploitation became instead a grinding, static battle of attrition, allowing the German forces to effectively contain the invasion force and stabilize their front. The massive logistical tail, the ultimate strength of the Allied war machine, had temporarily become its Achilles heel, nearly costing the Allies the success of the entire invasion. The initial failure to quickly secure a major port, combined with the unpredictability of the weather, created a cascading logistical failure that dramatically prolonged the fighting and increased the eventual casualty count. Halt! Hold your fire. You're deep inside the fog of war now, fighting the German tanks and the unpredictable Channel weather. The logistical line is breaking, and the entire operation is running on fumes. If you understand the strategic gravity of this fuel crisis, we need you to maintain our strength. Hit subscribe and secure our communications. And now, let's talk strategy. What is the greatest logistical threat to a modern army? Was it the lack of fuel, the inadequate port capacity, or the German destruction of railroads? Comment below with your tactical assessment and suggest the next historical crisis our unit should analyze. Let's keep the historical debate alive. As the Allied armies struggled against the German defenses and the crippling logistical issues, the operation was further endangered by a profound and shocking internal crisis. A series of devastating friendly fire incidents that resulted in the loss of critical personnel and the erosion of trust between the ground troops and the air forces. The Allies enjoyed total, unchallenged air superiority over the Normandy battlefield, a decisive advantage that should have provided continuous close air support and protection from German armored counterattacks. However, the very speed and effectiveness of the tactical air forces combined with the dense, confusing terrain of the bocage created a dangerous scenario where coordination between air and ground units was frequently impossible, leading to tragic and entirely avoidable losses. The most notorious and devastating of these incidents occurred during the massive pre-offensive bombardment for Operation Cobra, the planned breakout. The Allied High Command, recognizing that the bocage could only be cracked by overwhelming force, decided to launch a carpet bombing campaign of unparalleled intensity against the German defensive lines around St. Lo. This saturation bombing was intended to literally vaporize the German strongpoints and pave the way for the American armored divisions to punch through the line. The sheer weight of bombs dropped was immense, involving thousands of heavy bombers attacking a narrow sector just ahead of the American lines. However, the execution was tragically flawed. The plan called for the bombers to fly parallel to the American positions to ensure that any short bombs would land on friendly troops. But due to a combination of visual markers being obscured by dust and smoke, pilots misreading coordinates, and, in some cases, a change in wind direction, a significant portion of the bombs fell directly onto the forward American lines. The result was an immediate, catastrophic friendly fire disaster. Hundreds of American soldiers were killed instantly, and thousands were wounded by the massive bombs intended for the enemy. The carnage was immense, destroying entire forward companies and critically killing some of the most experienced and respected senior officers, including Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair, the head of the Army Ground Forces, who was present near the front lines to observe the offensive. The psychological impact on the surviving troops was devastating. The men who had endured the German shell fire now found themselves being mercilessly attacked by their own side, a blow that shattered morale and created a deep, immediate mistrust of the air forces. The ground troops felt betrayed by the very element that was supposed to be their greatest protector. This breakdown in trust between the air and ground elements was a major operational problem, forcing the High Command to halt the bombing temporarily and implement new, more cautious coordination procedures. This friendly fire crisis was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a larger systemic problem in coordinating the massive, high-speed Allied war machine. The sheer density of the bocage and the difficulty of accurately identifying friend from foe in the confined space of the hedgerows made the use of close air support a perpetual, high-risk proposition. German forces, often hidden only a few hundred yards from the American positions, were experts at taking advantage of this confusion, drawing Allied fire onto their own lines by using captured or identical radio equipment. The use of brightly colored smoke and identification panels for friendly troops was not always effective in the swirling dust and smoke of the battlefield, leading to further tragic errors. The overall effect was a crippling loss of confidence in the air-ground link-up, forcing the infantry to often rely solely on their own organic artillery and firepower, thereby slowing the entire advance. The friendly fire disaster became a major hidden cost of the D-Day operation. It not only caused direct casualties, but also undermined the core strategic advantage of the Allies: the ability to deliver overwhelming coordinated firepower from the sea, air, and ground. The subsequent delay and the forced caution in the use of air power provided the German defenders with a brief but critical respite, allowing them to reorganize and brace for the next offensive. The event remains a somber reminder that in the heat and chaos of large-scale modern warfare, the greatest danger can sometimes come from a misplaced coordinate or a momentary lapse in judgment high above the battle, turning the most powerful weapon in the arsenal against its own men. The battle for Normandy was fought against the enemy, the terrain, the weather, and tragically at times, against the very forces intended to guarantee victory. While the Allied forces struggled against the brutal reality of the bocage and the self-inflicted wounds of friendly fire, the German command structure was spiraling into a deep operational paralysis, an internal crisis that ultimately provided the Allies with the margin they needed for their eventual breakout. The German defense, highly effective at the tactical level, was severely hampered at the strategic level by the continuous, destructive interference of Adolf Hitler, operating from his distant headquarters in Eastern Europe. Hitler's rigid, irrational orders based on his own preconceived notions of warfare rather than the reality of the front neutralized the talent of his best field commanders and led to a series of disastrous strategic decisions that prevented any coordinated, effective counter-response to the Allied lodgment. The greatest strategic error of the German defense was not the failure to hold the beaches, but the inability of the commanders to maneuver their forces effectively once the beaches were secured. The core of the problem lay in Hitler's unwavering belief that the Normandy landings were a diversionary attack, and that the main Allied invasion, led by the fictional American army commanded by General Patton, would still come across the Pas de Calais. This belief, brilliantly reinforced by the Allied deception plan, Operation Fortitude, paralyzed the movement of crucial German reserves. Hitler explicitly forbade the movement of the powerful 15th Army stationed in the Pas de Calais for weeks after D-Day, despite the frantic pleas of his field marshals Rommel and von Rundstedt, who recognized the undeniable scale of the Normandy invasion. This refusal to commit the strategic reserve provided the Allied forces with the invaluable time needed to solidify their beachheads and establish the necessary logistical base to survive the subsequent fighting. The German strategy was thus fatally compromised. They were fighting a massive war of attrition with only a portion of their available strength, constantly looking over their shoulder at a phantom army that existed only in the deception plans and Hitler's mind. Furthermore, Hitler's tactical philosophy was characterized by an irrational demand for holding ground at all costs, regardless of the strategic or tactical reality. He explicitly forbade any elastic defense or maneuver warfare, the very tactics that had made the German army so formidable in previous campaigns. Instead, he ordered his commanders to engage in a rigid, fixed defense, throwing their precious armored divisions into piecemeal, head-on counterattacks against the strongest parts of the Allied line. This no-retreat order was disastrous in the Bocage environment, where Allied air superiority made fixed defense untenable. The German armored divisions, committed to these futile, suicidal counterattacks, were chewed up and decimated by Allied artillery and fighter bombers, their strength bleeding away in 1,000 small, irreversible engagements. Commanders like Rommel, who argued for a more flexible, mobile defense that would allow the forces to trade space for time, were constantly overruled and had their authority undermined by the dictates of the distant Führer. The consequence of this command paralysis was the progressive attrition and destruction of the German forces in Normandy without achieving any strategic objective. The constant, irrational orders, the political infighting between the German commanders, and the total lack of decentralized command meant that the German army was fighting with one hand tied behind its back. The Allied forces, despite their own tactical and logistical errors, were ultimately fighting a coherent, unified war under a clear, if sometimes flawed, chain of command. The Germans, conversely, were fighting an internal battle of strategy, logistics, and ego, with the ultimate decisive authority residing with a man who was psychologically incapable of accepting the reality of the front. This command failure was the ultimate invisible tactical error that the Allies could not have planned for, but which ultimately guaranteed their success. The courage and skill of the German soldier were cancelled out by the strategic incompetence and the rigid, paralyzing control exerted by the distant high command, turning the formidable German defense into a slow, grinding mechanism of self-destruction. The crippling stalemate in the Bocage, which had lasted for nearly 7 weeks, demanded not just overwhelming force, but a genuine tactical innovation to overcome the seemingly impenetrable German defense. The battle had devolved into a war of attrition, with the Allies suffering heavy casualties and failing to achieve the necessary speed for a strategic breakout. The key lay in defeating the Bocage itself, neutralizing the very advantage that the terrain gave the German defenders. The solution, an ingenious and crude piece of battlefield engineering, came not from the high command, but from the ranks of the American armored units. This innovation, born of necessity and frustration, proved to be the decisive element that broke the Bocage stalemate and set the stage for the massive armored breakout. The problem, as established in the previous weeks of brutal fighting, was simple. The Sherman tank, the workhorse of the American armored force, could not effectively breach the thick, high earthen hedgerows. Attempts to climb them exposed the tank's thin belly armor to German anti-tank fire, and simply ramming them was often futile and damaging to the tank. A solution was found by Sergeant Curtis G. Cullen, an American tanker who, using a simple but profound insight, observed the success of an improvised device being used on a bulldozer blade to cut through the hedgerows. He theorized that a similar device could be welded to the front of a tank, allowing it to cut through the base of the hedgerow rather than trying to climb over it. The result was the Rhino tank hedge cutter. This innovation was surprisingly simple. 4 sharpened steel prongs, often salvaged from German beach obstacles, were welded onto the front of the Sherman tank. These prongs would dig into the base of the hedgerow, ripping the earth and roots apart, and creating a clear, armor-protected path for the tank and the following infantry. The effectiveness was immediate and revolutionary. The Rhino tanks could now punch through the hedgerows at speed, neutralizing the German anti-tank ambush points and restoring the crucial element of mobility to the American armored divisions. The tactical significance of this crude innovation cannot be overstated. It was the decisive factor that overcame the natural defense of the Bocage and allowed the American forces to finally turn the tide of the ground war. Mass production of the hedge cutter attachments began immediately, transforming the entire American armored force into a formidable, Bocage-defeating machine. The stage was now set for Operation Cobra, the long-delayed final breakout offensive. The plan, masterminded by General Omar Bradley, was a bold, unprecedented gamble: to concentrate a massive force, spearheaded by the Rhino tanks, on a narrow front, and use the sheer weight of firepower to smash a hole through the German lines, followed by a rapid, deep penetration by the armored divisions. The offensive was preceded by the tragic friendly fire incident, but once the dust settled and the line was reorganized, the attack went forward. The initial phase, the capture of the heavily defended city of St. Lo, was a brutal, slow, but ultimately successful operation that saw the American forces finally break the rigid German line of containment. The key to the breakthrough, however, was the final decisive use of the Rhino tanks, which allowed the armored divisions to quickly move off the main roads and through the fields, bypassing the fixed German defenses and tearing open the German rear area. The success of Cobra was immediate and overwhelming. The American armored forces, now utilizing their newfound mobility, poured through the breach in a rapid, continuous stream, finally achieving the swift breakout that had been planned for weeks earlier. The German defense, which had been designed for a static war of attrition in the Bocage, was now hopelessly exposed to a rapid, mobile war of maneuver, a style of warfare in which the Allies, with their vast air and fuel superiority, were entirely dominant. The German front lines crumbled, their divisions were bypassed and encircled, and the entire German defense in Normandy spiraled into a catastrophic, irreversible collapse. The capture of St. Lo, enabled by the simple, humble innovation of the Rhino tank, was the pivot point that saved the D-Day operation from becoming a prolonged, costly siege. It was a victory of ingenuity over complexity, a small piece of welding that fundamentally altered the tactical reality of the entire Western Front. The catastrophic collapse of the German front following Operation Cobra created the greatest opportunity for a total decisive victory in the Western Front since the fall of France. The potential complete encirclement and annihilation of the entire German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army in the area known as the Falaise Pocket. The Allied forces, finally unleashed from the Bocage, were moving with unprecedented speed, executing a massive, coordinated maneuver that aimed to trap over 200,000 German soldiers in a rapidly closing vise between the American, Canadian, and Polish forces. This was the moment of strategic payoff, the chance to destroy the German fighting force in the West and potentially shorten the war by months. However, once again, a combination of command hesitation, logistical strain, and the sheer tenacity of the remaining German defenders prevented the total decisive victory that the situation demanded. The plan was a textbook maneuver. The American forces, led by General Patton's Third Army, swept rapidly south and east, aiming to cut off the German retreat routes. Simultaneously, the British and Canadian forces, pushing from the north, drove toward the key town of Falaise, the intended northern hinge of the trap. The gap between the two forces, the eventual Falaise pocket, closed rapidly, creating a massive, terrifying bottleneck for the retreating German armies. The sight inside the pocket was one of unmitigated chaos. Thousands of vehicles, tanks, and men trapped on narrow roads, mercilessly bombed and shelled by the continuous total air superiority of the Allied air forces now operating in a bocage-free environment. The Falaise Gap became a killing zone, a scene of carnage so immense that Allied troops who witnessed it later described it as one of the most horrifying sights of the entire war. The German forces were being systematically destroyed, their vehicles burning, their men desperately attempting to escape the tightening circle. The ultimate failure lay in the command hesitation at the final, crucial moment. General Bradley, cautious after the near disasters of the previous weeks, and concerned about the potential for German counterattacks and the risk of friendly fire between the rapidly converging Allied armies, ordered Patton's American forces to halt their advance near the town of Argentan, the southern hinge of the pocket, before they could fully link up with the Canadian and Polish forces pushing from the north. This decision, aimed at ensuring command safety, inadvertently left a small but critical escape gap, the Falaise Gap, open for nearly 3 crucial days. This narrow corridor, under continuous Allied fire, became the only avenue of escape for the desperate German forces. The German commanders, recognizing their imminent destruction, utilized the remaining elite SS and Panzer units to establish a fierce, suicidal defensive screen around the gap, holding the desperate Allied advance just long enough for the bulk of their forces to escape. Through this narrow, hellish corridor, a significant portion of the German 7th and 5th Panzer armies managed to escape the trap. The ultimate verdict on the D-Day invasion and the ensuing Battle of Normandy is a complex one, a judgment that must balance the undeniable monumental success of the operation with the multitude of hidden tactical and logistical errors that nearly derailed it. D-Day was, by any measure, a strategic triumph. It successfully established the long-awaited Second Front in Europe, relieved the pressure on the Soviet Union, and set the stage for the final defeat of Nazi Germany. The fact that the invasion forces were not pushed back into the sea on the first day, a scenario that Hitler himself and many Allied planners feared, remains a testament to the courage of the individual soldier and the sheer overwhelming power of Allied industrial capacity and the dedication to air superiority. However, the true lesson of D-Day lies in the profound fragility of the initial success and the degree to which the operation flirted with catastrophic failure due to a series of critical, often unforeseen, errors. The primary factors that almost led to the loss of the invasion can be synthesized into a chain of tactical errors, each amplifying the other. The Omaha underestimation, the failure of intelligence and naval bombardment to account for the veteran 352nd Division, and the subsequent destruction of the DD tanks created a near-total tactical failure on the most crucial beachhead. The Bocage blind spot, the fatal underestimation of the defensive potential of the Norman hedgerows, immediately negated the Allied advantage in armor and speed, turning the planned sprint into a debilitating high-casualty crawl and straining the logistical chain to the breaking point. The friendly fire logistical crisis, the Great Storm, and the subsequent friendly fire disasters during Operation Cobra eroded morale, crippled the essential port capacity, and led to a critical fuel shortage, forcing a 3-week delay that allowed the German defense to stabilize. The Falaise hesitation. The final failure to completely close the Falaise pocket, a result of command caution, allowed the core of the German fighting force to escape, ensuring that the war would be prolonged into the next year. Despite these critical failures, the operation succeeded due to two overriding, fundamental advantages that no German tactical skill could overcome. First, the overwhelming total air superiority of the Allied forces rendered any large-scale German counterattack or daylight movement impossible. This air dominance was the ultimate insurance policy for the invasion, preventing the German armored reserves from ever being effectively used. Second, the infinite Allied logistical and industrial capacity meant that every setback, every destroyed Sherman tank, every lost landing craft, and every casualty could be replaced with a continuous, relentless stream of men and materiel. The Germans, fighting with finite resources and crippled supply lines, were fighting a battle of attrition that they were mathematically destined to lose. The time bought by the Fallschirmjäger at Monte Cassino and the stubborn defense in the Bocage merely delayed the inevitable. It did not change the final strategic outcome. The ultimate irony of D-Day is that the greatest tactical failures, the near disaster at Omaha and the agonizing slowness in the Bocage, were overcome not by a brilliant, perfect plan, but by the brutal simple power of decentralized command and sheer industrial weight. The individual initiative of soldiers like Sergeant Kulin, who invented the Rhino tank, and the relentless, if costly, decision by commanders like Bradley and Patton to commit every resource necessary ultimately redeemed the errors of the planning stage. The success of D-Day was a triumph of the will and the supply line over the brilliant defense of a desperate, resource-starved enemy. The hidden tactical errors did not lose the war, but they cost the Allies months of fighting and thousands of lives. A profound, sobering reminder that even the most meticulously planned operation is ultimately subject to the chaos of war, the unpredictability of the weather, and the sheer individual tenacity of the men who fight on the ground. The price of the hidden errors of D-Day was paid forward in the fields and forests of Europe, ensuring that the final journey to Berlin would be a long, costly, and deeply challenging one. The invasion was won, but the victory was a testament to endurance, not perfection.